Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The House has voted to impeach President Trump, making him the first U.S. president to be impeached twice. The vote passed in the House with the support of 222 Democrats and 10 Republicans. The article now heads to the Senate, which will consider the charge of incitement of insurrection. The upper chamber will vote on whether to remove Mr. Trump from office. Lawmakers debated for hours Wednesday on the House floor. Here is some of what you may have missed.
Every second that this president remains in office is a danger to this country and to the world. We have no idea what he is capable of doing, whether he will pardon these terrorists, whether he will go to war.
What's being debated is whether, with 167 hours left until he leaves office, is he a clear and present danger? And he clearly isn't. The president has acted substantially the same for 4 years.
The far right is calling for return engagement from January 17th to January 20th. They're asking the president to pardon the conspirators in last week's rampage as they prepare for a race war again next week. And it's a bit much to be hearing that these people would not be trying to destroy our government and kill us if we just weren't so mean to them.
My vote to impeach our sitting president is not a fear-based decision. I am not choosing a side, I'm choosing truth. It's the only way to defeat fear.
At a time when our country needs unity, it is concerning that my Democratic colleagues have chosen to begin impeachment proceedings against a president with just 7 days left in office.
History is watching and saving the receipts. Today, my colleagues across the aisle must choose which side of a very bright line they want to be recorded on for all time.
All this comes as a defense official confirms the National Guard is deploying 5,000 more troops to Washington ahead of the inauguration next week. That brings the total number of troops to 20,000. Meantime, CBS News has also learned that the FBI is warning law enforcement agencies to, quote, use caution and consider the use of SWAT when moving in to arrest suspects in last week's deadly Capitol attack. The Bureau included a photo of this arsenal of firearms found in a suspect's home. Nancy Cordes and Major Garrett join me now. Nancy is CBS News chief congressional correspondent, and Major is our chief Washington correspondent. Welcome. It's good to have you both. Nancy, let's start with the next steps now in this impeachment process. The Senate is not scheduled to come back into session until the day before inauguration. So what does that mean for the prospect of removal? And is there any groundswell of Republican support growing against President Trump?
Well, Elaine, just in the past few minutes, we got a new statement from the Senate's Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, who will control this Senate chamber for just a few days longer until Democrats take control after 2 new Democratic senators are sworn in from Georgia. He says that even if the Senate process were to begin this week and move promptly, no final verdict would be reached until after President Trump had left office. This is not a decision I'm making, it's a fact. And so therefore, he says, in light of this reality, I believe it would best serve our nation if Congress and the executive branch spend the next 7 days completely focused on facilitating a safe inauguration and then move to this article of impeachment after that. So basically, what the leader is saying once and for all is he's not bringing the Senate back early, and he doesn't even think that it is prudent or feasible to start this trial 1 day before President-elect Biden gets sworn in next week when the Senate comes back. And what that likely means is that we're looking at a Senate trial that would get underway just after President-elect Biden takes office. Now, how long will that trial last? It's anybody's guess. As Leader McConnell points out in this statement, the impeachment trials of the past have lasted 83 days in one case, 37 days in the case of President Clinton, 21 days in the case of the last impeachment trial for President Trump. I don't think that this trial would last as long as that one. This is a pretty clear-cut case. Everyone knows what happened here. It's far less complicated than the Ukrainian scheme that he was impeached for last time. But still, it is going to tie up Senate business for a week or two right at the start of the Biden administration.
You know, Major, you're always so great at giving us some perspective. So let's get a look at this in a broader sort of historical context here. We've had 3 presidents that have been impeached: President Trump, Bill Clinton, and Andrew Johnson. Now, all 3 were acquitted by the Senate. But give us a sense of the implications and the precedent that could come with this Senate vote, even if it happens after President-elect Biden takes office.
I'll get to that in a second, Elaine, but it's very important what Nancy just reported from the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And note again, he did not offer any opinion on the merits of what the president did and whether or not that's an impeachable offense. He merely talks about, well, the timing of this is complicated and it will bleed into the Biden administration. And also saying everyone in Washington, it's his opinion, should focus entirely on a safe inauguration. He included the executive branch in that statement. And I guarantee you, at the highest levels of the Republican congressional leadership, that is the message being sent to the president. And you can be sure some of it penetrated today because the president released a statement opposing all violence, taking note of reports about people coming to Washington in support of him to commit acts of violence, and saying he opposes all of that in all of its forms. It is my understanding through talking to congressional Republicans that that statement was in part due to the White House fear and the president's fear, because there's hardly anyone else working around him right now, principally the president's fear, that if he didn't put out a statement like that, the vote to impeachment among Republican ranks would have been higher. And this statement was meant to keep that comparatively low. 10 votes is still 10 votes, but it could have been higher. And that statement was meant to keep that down, to keep that number down. So that's really important about where we are right now. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy are telling this White House, we have got to get to January 20th, and you, Mr. President, have some responsibility for how that goes. And that statement from the president is consistent with the message I believe they have been delivering. So the broader context here. Most of the House Republicans who voted not to impeach the president and who complained about the resolution today also sidestepped the merits of the underlying question. Did the president, through his rhetoric from Election Day forward, create an atmosphere of incitement around what happened on January 6th? They did not want to get into that. Some did, but most did not. They complained about the process. It was too fast. It was setting a bad precedent. Well, the country saw what happened on January 6th. We don't need an investigative hearing to learn what happened. And there's a body of evidence about how it got started and how it was fueled and how it was intensified, principally by the president's rhetoric and those who support him. So the context of all of this, Elaine, to get your question is, this is a moment in American history in which the institution of the House of Representatives had to do something. You cannot be attacked by the executive branch and do nothing. And the Democratic majority said the remedy for that, the institutional response, is to impeach the president, who we believe incited this attack on the Capitol. Censure was an option. But the House Democratic majority didn't want to go down that road. They wanted to send a clear signal that for all time, incitement like this, the executive branch attacking the legislative branch, gets one response and one response only. Even if there's only 7 days left of a presidency, you will be impeached. That's a marker that clearly the House Democratic caucus felt comfortable with, and most Republicans did not want to confront on the merits of that underlying argument. That is an important part of this history.
That is a really important point. Major, I just want to go back to something you said a moment ago, that in your conversations surrounding the statement that was issued by President Trump, was there any discussion, in addition to the political reasons for wanting to craft and release that written statement, was there any discussion at all or reflection at all on the part of the president about the perhaps imminent threat that might be looming, in addition to the political considerations? I wonder if there was any talk of that at all.
Well, clearly that's part of the atmosphere about all of this, Elaine. It's part of why we have more U.S. forces protecting the Capitol than we have deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq combined. Most Americans can't even begin to process that in all of its totality and of its immense importance. Like, what, seriously? That's what we've had to do? We've had to place more troops inside the Capitol, protected from Americans, than we have deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan? But that's the truth. And part of this is, to the president, congressional Republicans are saying this is real. These things are being talked about on the web. January 17th to January 20th could be this point of return violence. You've got to do something. And if you're not going to do it just on the basis of whether you believe it's true or not true, or you think they're all motivated by wanting to protect you, just think about the impeachment vote itself. Do it for that, if no other reason. I believe all of these conversations flow into one another and circle around one another because you can't separate them. The attack on the Capitol and the sense of grievance stoked by this president are completely linked. There is no separation there. And this sense that we'll get him again next time is about the Trump-inspired mythology around this election, which the president still will not address. I guarantee you Republicans would love for him to say, look, it's over. It was a fair election, but the president can't do that. He is so put himself in a corner on that, he won't do that. But he will come out against violence, and I guarantee you, senior congressional Republicans in the House and Senate will take anything they can get from the president right now, anything at all, that talks about deterring, repelling, and discouraging violence, because without that, they believe the Capitol is and the city of Washington, D.C. itself is under greater threat.
So, Nancy, I think it's worth just taking a step back. Major explained that statement that we saw from President Trump. The president and his allies have maintained that that attack, of course, is not what they advocated for, but I think it's worth us pausing here. And I want to play some of what they were saying up through the day of the assault itself. Let's listen to some of that.
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that.
Will you urge your supporters to stay calm during this extended period, not to engage in any civil unrest? You go first.
I'm urging my supporters to go into the polls and watch very carefully, because that's what has to happen.
If you're going to be the zero and not the hero, we're coming for you, and we're going to have a good time doing it.
If we're wrong, we will be made fools of. But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So let's have trial by combat.
Nancy, are these the types of words that are essentially Exhibit A when it comes to the impeachment charge?
Yes, and I think it's worth sort of stepping back and recognizing how unusual this kind of speech is in our public political discourse. We're used to this kind of bellicose language from the President of the United States, but we're not used to seeing it from other politicians. How many politicians can you think of in modern American history who have claimed that they won when they lost, who have refused to concede, who have insisted that there was widespread fraud when there was no evidence of it, who encouraged their supporters to go watch the polls and look for wrongdoing? You know, it's so common from this president that we really don't dwell on it. But the reality is that that was a complete departure from the norm in American political discourse, and it lasted for months. And not only did it last for months, but because so many Republicans are scared of getting crosswise with the president, it led them to refuse to acknowledge that President-elect Biden had won the election. It led them to argue that there were still court cases going on when they knew that all of these cases were bogus. And it created an environment where some of the president's supporters, a small fraction of them, but enough to do real damage, felt that they needed to take matters into their own hands. So you can definitely draw a direct line from the things that the president said and some of his top allies said and what happened here on Capitol Hill. What some Republicans argued today, or tried to argue in that impeachment debate, was that the president didn't literally mean that they should fight with their fists when he said you've got to fight on. That's just political rhetoric. Everybody uses that kind of language, that it is unfair to blame the violence of others on him, that he didn't want that. You know, we don't know for a fact what he wanted or what he didn't want, but I think that there is a pretty widespread consensus around here on Capitol Hill from Democrats and Republicans alike that he did a lot to stoke the flames, and that had he simply conceded like every other president does when they lose an election, maybe a week or two even after he lost, that we would never have seen what we did last week here at the Capitol.
Major, as that floor debate was going on throughout the day in the House, the Congressional Black Caucus was holding a hearing focused on the Capitol attack. And I want to play a clip from New York Democratic Congressman Hakeem Jeffries on how this fits into our larger American history. Let's listen to that.
America was founded with a birth defect, a genetic imperfection on the question of race. For 240 years, we've been trying to deal with that. And every time America makes progress, and we have made progress, the lesson of history teaches us there always is a backlash.
You know, Major, there's a point that has been raised many times over the past 4 years. But in this case, how different could the response have looked had it been President Obama who had said some of the things that were uttered from the presidential podium, and the actions were taken not by the crowd that we saw, but from people who were black and brown. Could you just give us a sense here of that? Because this conversation, it cannot be denied, has a component of race to it that cannot be divorced from our political conversations.
Let me take two approaches to that, Elaine. So I had lots of conversations with Republicans here in Washington late last week who said, oh, this impeachment vote, Nancy Pelosi is just trying to make us walk a political plank, take huge advantage of this, and all of us are under pressure, and it's going to be a vice grip because we're going to have people who are going to want on the corporate side for us to oppose the president. We're going to have the Trump base who wants us to stick with him. She's being so mean to us. And I said, okay, I hear you. Let me just sketch out a scenario for you. Take your memory back to the closing days of the Obama presidency, and let's just imagine a scenario. Let's just sketch this out. It's the closing days of the Obama presidency, and he says, because Congress has been so objecting to immigration reform, I want my supporters to go to Congress and to protest all over Congress and be strong about it. And those protesters, many of them brown, many of them black, storm the Capitol, break glass, bust down doors, besiege offices, chase members of Congress, bring a gallows, pepper spray, guns, clubs, and the like. Tell me, Republicans, that a House Republican majority under those circumstances would not attempt to impeach President Obama and would not have denounced that violence, that insurrection, the way Democrats are. I will tell you, Elaine, in all those conversations I had yesterday, there was a long, long pause, followed by, well, I take your point. So that's one way of thinking about this. The other way of thinking about it is that we have a history in our country of, as Hakeem Jeffries said, when there is a move to create a greater space of access to power, not necessarily power, but access to power for people who didn't previously have it, there has been resistance. Every step of the way. That's true with women's suffrage. It's true with providing the vote to African Americans. It's true in labor law. Everywhere where there wasn't access to power and we have created that access in that space, there has been resistance. And that is part and parcel of what we are seeing here now, this sense. And some members on the floor on the Republican side alluded to it ever so slightly today. Americans are frustrated. They're afraid of the way the country is changing. They didn't say it explicitly, but one of the things they're afraid of how it's changing is this greater access to power of people who previously didn't have that access, that entree. And that is part of the friction. And trying to come to grips with that is one thing. Giving any space at all, any permission space for violence, because of that, is impermissible in the long history of America, or at least it should have been, and certainly should be going forward.
Nancy Cordes and Major Garrett, these are such troubling times, but we are so grateful to have the both of you to help see our way through this. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.